Not the Sam Hill. How many times have we said that? And who was this guy, Sam Hill? Builder of the Peace Arch, and Mary Hill Museum, and the Stonehenge replica. But the real thing that's important about Sam Hill is his advocacy for paved roads. He was into making sure that we all had a comfortable ride across the countryside. As the head of the Good Roads Association, Sam Hill was a strong advocate for better highways and better roads. He even built this 8-mile section of highway down on the Columbia River near his Mary Hill home to show the legislature that this was a practical idea. The Washington legislature didn't buy it. So he went to Salem and brought the Oregon legislature over, and they bought it. They built the Columbia River Highway. And from there on, we saw paved roads going in all across our state. Mary Hill was designed to be just across the Cascade Curtain in better weather, and Sam Hill designed it for a house, but it never really became that. And his good friend convinced him, let's make it a museum. And they brought in beautiful thousands of pieces of artwork from all over the world, but especially Europe. And they located this spot for the enjoyment of the people of our region. And it's still there today, and it's a beautiful museum. Mary Hill is a real spot to visit in my mind. What the Sam Hill? One of my favorite guys and one of my favorite places.
Also, a lot of members brought home to meet folding chairs. Thank you for offering to help outfit the caucus room.
All right, well, good morning. Welcome, everybody. It is a big week for us. One of our highest priorities as a caucus, we have been saying consistently, is funding for our public schools. And this afternoon, I think in Ways and Means, we're going to be hearing bills on what the school districts lovingly refer to as the big three: special education funding, materials, supplies, and operating costs funding, and transportation funding for students. So we are hopeful that, notwithstanding the general budget challenge that we have this year, that we will be able to muster the resources to help out our school districts and make sure that we fulfill our paramount duty. Turn it over to the House.
I'm Joe Fitzgibbon, House Majority Leader. We have a number of bills moving forward in the House to address the high cost of living for Washingtonians. We have House Bill 1217 to cap the growth of rent at 7% per year, which passed out of House Appropriations yesterday. We have House Bill 1483, right to repair, to give Washingtonians more access to cheaper services to repair their electronic devices, and House Bill 1090, which was just moved onto the floor calendar to provide for 12 months of birth control when a prescription for birth control is filled. So we're looking at the cost of consumer products, the cost of healthcare, the cost of housing. We also have work going on the cost of transportation and childcare, but we have heard loud and clear that Washingtonians want us to be taking a look at every way we can reduce the cost of living, and that's one of the things we're focused on this year. Happy to take your questions.
You mentioned, Senator Peterson, the education bills are in Ways and Means, right? So is it your caucus's intention to vote on those bills prior to fiscal cutoff, or because they're all NTIB And then the House bills, I just like the House has other bills much more complicated but dealing with some of the same issues.
None of those bills is NTIB, so necessary to implement the budget. Spending bill, this is a common misconception. Just because something is in the budget doesn't mean that it's necessary to implement the budget, right? So revenue bills could wait until the end of session, and bills that change statutes to cut programs are necessary to implement they might be necessary to implement the budget, and we'll see some of those start to roll out. But the K-12 spending bills will need to move out of Ways and Means in some form before fiscal cutoff in order to advance this session.
Okay. Take me a minute to set this up. We've got 4 lawsuits against the Trump administration so far, or the state does, and 2 or 3 of them involve federal money coming to Washington State. I think just recently, both J.D. Vance and Elon Musk has said we don't have to follow what the courts tell us to do. How much does this, and I know there's a few $1 billion going into your budget that will come from the feds. Are you worried about this? Or is this more of the Trump administration blowing off steam? Or is this a legit threat? How much are you chewing your fingernails over this?
I don't think you can be awake in America right now and not be worrying, because we have a lawless federal administration that is rolling right over a compliant Congress and seems not to care what the Constitution or the courts have to say at this point. So, yes, in a world in which we help distribute billions of dollars to public schools and to people who need health care and to people working on cutting-edge research, that was the latest one in the paper this morning, we're worried about all of those things, and we worry about it every day.
I'll just add, this is an extremely concerning period of time. And I think anyone who doesn't think we are at the point of a constitutional crisis is not paying attention. We have one of the richest men in the world who is going after the poorest people in the United States of America. We're talking about access to health care. We're talking about even just simple data on take a look at cancer disparities. Take a look at healthcare disparities. We have data that's disappearing. This is extremely concerning. And on top of it, telling the judiciary that they don't have to listen to their orders. I mean, that's the fundamental foundation of the United States, where you have different branches of government that are supposed to provide those checks and balances. We're not seeing Congress do anything, and we're seeing the Trump administration thump their noses at the judicial branch. And so the question is, what is then left? So it's extremely concerning, and I think everyone should be extremely alarmed by what is happening at the federal level.
We're firm believers in the separation of powers, and the judicial branch of the federal government is doing what it can to rein in illegal moves by President Trump and Vice President Musk. What we really haven't seen yet is the legislative branch of the federal government step up to defend the rule of law. And so I think we're really counting on Congress to do that. All that said, we wouldn't get anything done if we spent our days, reading Truth Social posts and tweets about whatever the latest drama is in DC. We're focused on our work here, and I'm sure there will be impacts on our work sooner or later, but we can't forecast those right now. So we're really focused on our budget situation and our policy goals here in state government.
That's sort of a, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it type of stance. Am I interpreting you correctly?
For example, we could not write a budget that accounts for all of the potential Medicaid changes that Congress might enact. I certainly hope that Washington's members of Congress, particularly Representatives Baumgartner and Newhouse, will be thinking about the potential impacts on Washingtonians if, for example, Medicaid cuts are enacted. Those cuts would, of all our congressional districts, they would have the greatest impact on Representative Newhouse's district. So I certainly hope that they're paying attention to that, but the variability and the possible things that we could see Congress do is just impossible for us to plan for.
I'll just add in, Bob Ferguson as Attorney General, you guys all know this, sued and won 99 times against the Trump administration. And I have full faith that Nick Brown and his team are going to continue that. And so I'm just hoping the judicial branch is the one that's stepping up, especially in Washington and the Ninth Circuit. But this is where we need all the different branches of government to step up and do their job.
And it's heartening to see people like Jack Kuhnauer stand up and say, I'm not going to be the one about whom it said, where were all the lawyers when this was going on?
There's 6 school districts that have bonds on the ballot today. I know there are 2 bills. Representative Stonier, one of them is yours, to lower that threshold from 60 to 50%. I know there's a Senate version to 55. Is that going to happen this session? I know it's come up quite a few times in the past. And if so, why is that a good thing for the state?
Yeah, I sure hope so. I mean, we heard the bill in the House. Thrilled to see that there's conversation in the Senate around the different options that are possible for us to consider this session. The bonds that are on the ballot today would provide a safe learning environment for students in districts that really need them, and it's fair that the majority of the voters in those communities get to make those decisions by the same threshold that I was elected, that all of us were elected to serve in this body. So I'm hopeful that those will get some more conversation, some more movement this session. But because we're having a bicameral conversation, it's unclear about exactly what the path is going to be. We're going to keep the conversation alive. I remain very committed to 50%. I think it's important to make sure that the majority of people in each community get to decide what kinds of schools their kids go to. And then for the state, the more investment from local taxpayers, the more the state can do over time to get to some of the districts that are never going to be able to meet even that threshold. And that's kind of when you've got equity on the horizon in view. So yeah, I think we're going to make progress this year, and I'm thrilled to see movement in both chambers, and I'll be bothering everyone I can to keep it up.
Follow up on him. Apologize for jumping in. Your side just doesn't have the votes to do it. The Republicans are hardcore against it. Earlier this morning he said no one in our caucus are going to go for it. Can you comment on that? Essentially, I am throwing the scenario, you don't have the votes to get it done this session?
It is absolutely the case that if a constitutional amendment is going to change the threshold for approval of bonds, it will require bipartisan support and a bipartisan deal. So we are in conversation with Republicans and some of their most important stakeholders who are interested in coming to a deal, and I think it's possible. I wouldn't say that it's certain, or maybe even that it's likely, but we're exchanging drafts of language, and we know that there's, by the way, at least one Republican, Senator Harris, who's signed on to the bill at the memorial at 55%, and I think has indicated real interest in working on this issue. I suspect that there are others, but we need to have a deal and language so that we can have a bipartisan way to move forward on this.
In my conversations, in my conversations in the House, there are a number of Republicans across the aisle who know how badly their communities expect or want to see them vote on this issue. They will quietly tell me that they know their districts are impacted. And that conversation has been going on for a long time. They are very aware. Now, they may have a position on taxation that gets in the way of that, but there are a great deal of Republicans who know exactly how their districts are suffering as a result of this threshold. And Senator Peterson just gave you an example of one who's now over in the Senate, and that conversation is going to continue. I think people are going to come around to the idea that continuing to stifle the ability for a community to raise funds to build schools on the backs of a minority voice rather than the majority voice is going to take hold this session.
Senator Peterson, I wanted to ask you the comments of yours that, of course, went viral and got the attention of the president and DOJ, and lots of pushback on you with the comments about 13-year-olds and making their own health care, mental health decisions. I'm understanding from a note I received this morning that you've kind of said that that was taken out of context. If that is what you're saying, can you explain how it was taken out of context, or if you stand by what you said?
I stand by what I said. What I said was that you can't amend a law in our state without amending the law, right? And so this Initiative 2081, purported to give rights to parents about mental health and generally health care decisions without amending long-standing existing state law in various areas. You may remember that we had extensive conversation about this in the hearings on Initiative 2081. I asked nonpartisan staff, does this amend our existing law on the right of young people to make their own mental health care decisions if they're 13 or older? Does it amend existing state law on the right of women of any age to make their own reproductive health care decisions? And nonpartisan staff said, no, it couldn't, because that would be unconstitutional. We said, okay, we'll take your word for that. If there's confusion about that, we'll be back to amend the statute that we're about to pass. Guess what? There was confusion. So in the Fox News interview, I said, we have existing state law that provides that people, young people over 13 years and older, have a right to make mental health care decisions without the consent of without knowledge of or consent of their parents. Fox News chose to edit my comments and remove the reference, edit them by clipping it mid-sentence and removing the statements about existing state law to make it sound like my statement of fact about what current state law is was my personal opinion.
Is that your personal opinion, though?
You know, my personal opinion is that that has been decided for more than 40 years by the democratic process in the state of Washington. That is the law of Washington. And that if somebody wants to change that law, then that person will need to bring a bill through the process. And guess what? People have been trying for decades on the other side of the aisle. Senator Patton, whom I worked with closely, as did Senator Dingra, repeatedly brought bills trying to undo the law in Washington and require parental notification for abortion. And that bill does not enjoy the support of a majority of people in the legislature. It never advanced, right? Even when the Republicans were in control of the Senate. So now the idea that without amending the statute as is required by law, required by our Constitution, you could use this sneaky language in the initiative to change a statute that you failed to do through the legal democratic process, it's just laughable, right? So I absolutely stand by exactly what I said, which is that that is the law of Washington.
And I'll just add, you know, when we took a look at age of consent, and last year we found that 13-year-olds, if they needed a forensic sexual examination, the parents were being notified. This body unanimously voted on the Senate floor to allow for no parental notification on sexual forensic examination for 13-year-olds. That was a vote we took, and that is how you change the law, is to actually have a discussion and a conversation about the law. And that is what I reminded people, because everyone who was here last year voted yes to allow 13-year-olds to make their own decisions regarding sexual assault.
You mean all the Democrats, right?
No, and the Republicans. It was unanimous off that floor. And if you remember the colloquy on the floor, because they had raised concerns about age of consent to 13. And I had told them very clearly, when you're talking about sexual assault, the first instinct a child has when they're hurt or injured is to go to the parent or their loved one. The fact that they're not tells you there's a problem. And so the only person who was being helped by not changing that law was the rapist. And that's why the age of consent to 13 for forensic sexual examination was voted for on the floor. You cannot then come by, not change the statute, and think you can change the law. It's outrageous. If you want to have an honest conversation on what is going on in our schools with our children, have that honest conversation. Don't be trying to be sneaky and do things that somehow take away the age of consent in the state of Washington, which has been the law for 40 years.
You may be noticing a theme in our answers today, which is we have this now quaint viewpoint that the Constitution and laws of the United States and the Constitution and laws of the state of Washington are what we took our oath to uphold.
Totally different subject. Go ahead.
Can I just ask about childcare? I know that there are a couple of proposals making their way around right now that would delay the expansion of Fair Start. At this point, is it becoming any clearer that that is the path that you're going to take in terms of budgeting to align with like Inslee's proposal and I think Ferguson's proposal as well? And if so, can you talk a little bit more about the supports that you might also be discussing for families to get access and also for providers?
I can say on the House side, we do expect that we will need to delay the start dates for both the eligibility expansion and the rate increases that the Fair Starts for Kids Act had programmed for the coming years. That bill is scheduled to be exec out of appropriations tomorrow. Our budget situation is such that we would prefer to delay benefit increases and rate increases rather than to cut benefits and cut existing rates. So that is something that, for the House, we expect to be part of our budget proposal.
House Bill 1764 proposes raising the state's minimum wage to $25 an hour by 2031 through yearly increases of $1.50 or $1.50 beginning in January. Do you think that this bill is an effective method of addressing affordability issues across the state?
We are, I think, proud of the increases in Washington's minimum wage that we've seen, enacted by the voters, and then continue to increase through the cost of living adjustment that the voters also approved. We know Washingtonians in every part of the state struggle to pay rent, to pay grocery bills, to fill up with a tank of gas, to pay for childcare and health care, and we don't think it's ever a bad time to be confronted with those realities that our constituents are going through. And I think that the hearing on that bill and the conversation around that bill, is another important reminder for legislators what our constituents struggle with when they're, working to make ends meet. Do I think that we're likely to pass that bill this year? I think it's probably not a year that we're going to see that bill become law, but it's also important, including in our budget development process, as well as with the policy bills that we are advancing, that we have very front of mind what folks that we represent are going through.
And then that's the reality of what is a minimum wage versus what's a living wage, right? You need people to be able to earn enough to live in the communities where they're working. And we're not seeing that, especially in King County, especially in my district. People simply are not making a living wage. And so, again, we have to have those honest conversations on what does it take for people to be able to have a family, live where they work, and be successful.
There was an article in the Columbian this weekend illustrating how at the current minimum wage, people living in Vancouver cannot even afford a modest one-bedroom rental to live in. So keeping these problems that our constituents are facing front and center is an important reminder, as the majority leader just said, for us as we're doing our work, because a lot of the decisions we make are going to have a direct impact on people's ability to keep a roof over their homes and have access to health care. Whether or not somebody can make enough money to do that is a question we should be asking every step of the way this session.
Today, House Bill 1334 was heard. It would modify the annual regular property tax revenue growth limit. Critics of the measure fear that it would basically tax property owners out of their homes. Where do you all stand on the idea of raising the annual regular property tax revenue growth limit?
So the most expensive thing that local governments have to do, cities and counties, is provide for public safety and police protection. And we've heard a lot of concern and frustration over inadequately staffed police departments and sheriff's offices across the state, cities, counties, big, small jurisdictions. The 1% property tax growth limit essentially ratchets down property taxes relative to inflation every year, because inflation is almost always over 1%. It's been much, much over 1% in recent years. You cannot expect local governments to provide adequate police protection if you are cutting their revenue year over year, which is the effect of the 1% property tax limit. Public safety is one of the things that we hear the most about from our constituents, and if cities and counties are going to be able to do what we have assigned them the responsibility to do, which is provide police protection, they need adequate revenues. So I absolutely support that bill. Whether or not that or some other solution or some other combination of solutions is how we help local governments stabilize their budgets. It's not just the state budget that impacts people, it's also local budgets. I know I heard from King County last week that they're looking at a $30 million cut in their sheriff's office budget and a $15 million cut in the prosecutor's office budget, and I think about $15 million in cuts for district and superior court. Those cuts are not conducive to keeping people safe in the jurisdictions that they are responsible for. And I think we need to be very aware of the pressures that our local government's budgets are under if we expect them to perform the roles that we have assigned them.
I was just playing in my head the number of times I've heard the Republicans recite statistics about where Washington falls towards the bottom on things. I think you all have been an audience for those statistics a number of times. This is one when it comes to public safety and law enforcement where we can really make a difference in those statistics, and I'm a little surprised that they aren't willing to see the through line there. I think it's an important thing for us to do to help local governments pay their bills and keep our communities safe.
I'm sorry. Well, I'll just also observe, we've heard a lot from House and Senate Republicans about their opposition to capping rent increases at 7% a year. This bill proposes to cap property tax increases at 3% a year. So on one hand, they're saying 7% is way too low, and on the other hand, they're saying that 3% is way too high. I don't know how they square that.
I agree with all of what my House colleagues say. I will add that it's not an issue that affects only local governments. For more than 50 years, 100% of the state property tax has been dedicated to public schools. And a major reason for our consistent inability to fund public schools the way they should be is that our property tax revenue gets cramped down by the 1% cap in property tax growth. So I think it's absolutely important also for our ability to fulfill our paramount duty and fund public schools. That said, I think we've also heard very clearly from people who are worried about the burden of property taxes, from individual homeowners who are worried about the property tax burden. And so we are actively exploring the possibility of creating a primary residence property tax exemption that would help out real human beings who own their houses, and shift more of the burden onto people who own mansions, people who own second homes, large commercial enterprises that right now are not paying their fair share but are also benefited by this 1% cap.
Can I follow up on this really quickly? The Association of Washington Cities and Counties have really been pushing for this cap to be changed. And unlike school bonds, constitutional amendment, you don't necessarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, need bipartisan support to accomplish that. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess, what's the hesitation of changing this property tax thing when your counties and cities are saying, please change this yesterday? Like, I guess, what's holding you back from that? What's the thinking there?
Property taxes are really badly understood, right? And it's very easy to demagogue this. So the sponsor of the original initiative, Initiative 747, that established the 1%, will frequently say to his thousands of supporters statewide that they want to triple your property taxes, which makes somebody in Montlake who pays $15,000 a year in property taxes think that the property tax bill is going to be $45,000 if we pass the bill, right? Not only is it not $45,000, but the increase won't even be 1% to 3% because we're talking only about a relatively small share of the property taxes, only the ones that are the base property taxes imposed by school districts or cities, counties, and the state, right? Not the school district ones, which are voter approved, not the ones for all of the special levies from the city and the county that the voters approve. So only that small slice would go up by 3% instead of 1%. In fact, the experience that people would have in their property tax bill is relatively small, but it's complicated to explain that. And, I don't envy all of you trying to convey to your readers and listeners how property taxes actually work, but it's much easier to scare people with words like triple that just don't have any basis in reality.
I would emphatically agree with Senator Peterson. Nobody is proposing tripling property taxes. Nobody would vote for that. We would never contemplate that. What we are contemplating, and what I personally support, is not lowering property taxes relative to inflation every year, because that starves local governments of their resources. I'll say just sort of more like why I think this is hard, in addition to what Senator Peterson said, is most Washingtonians pay much more in sales tax than they pay in property taxes, but they pay sales tax in many small increments, whereas you pay your property taxes, typically twice a year. I think this is also, in the transportation space, gas taxes you pay in many small increments, your vehicle tabs you pay once a year. So vehicle tabs seem much more expensive than gas tax, even though most drivers pay much more in gas tax. Most, whether you're a property owner or a renter, your renter, you're not seeing your property tax bills, you're paying that through your rent. But if you're a property owner, your property tax is a bill that comes twice a year, and so it feels like a lot. It is a lot. But the sales tax, which is, a much bigger impact for most family budgets, is not noticed in the same way. So I think that's one of the reasons that, it's a challenging conversation.
Senator, last session, you carried a bill that would have raised the limit to 3% just for local governments. Are you planning to do that again, or are you waiting for the House, which has combined the state tax, which you did not have, and local tax?
I don't think we have a firm view on that. That would be an example of a bill that is affects state revenue and therefore is not subject to the cutoff. We had pretty extensive conversation about it last year in the Senate, and I'm glad that the conversation is going on right now in the House. I hope that it's something that we'll send to the governor's desk.
Any thoughts on Representative Fai's plan to implement a road usage charge? You know, he's arguing supplements, falling gas tax revenues. Well, Republicans seem to doubt that you can get majority support in the legislature. Any thoughts?
So I believe Representative Fai is having a media availability later today, so I definitely would encourage folks who are interested in that topic to talk with Representative Fai directly. There is no question that gas tax revenues are declining as we move to more fuel-efficient vehicles, and it is not a stable leg of the stool upon which to rest our transportation budgets. I think a road usage charge is something we are going to have to do if we want to keep having bridges that are safe and highways without potholes and ferries on the water. We are going to need to stabilize our transportation funding system, and that is one of the options that we are looking at this year to do that. I will also say this. This is my 15th year in the legislature. We have been talking about it the whole time I've been here. So whether or not this is the year that it becomes law, I won't predict, but I do think that we are going to need a more stable revenue structure than the gas tax provides for the transportation budget.
The senators, any appetite there? There'll be a hearing this week, but I mean, is it?
My understanding is that there's some steps that need to happen in law to allow the department to explore and do some more study of the possibility. I think given the decline in gas tax revenues and the even greater decline that we expect as people shift to electric vehicles, we're absolutely going to have to explore other ways of supporting our transportation budget. And I think it's good to have that as an option to consider. We might also have system-wide tolling as a way to achieve that. There are all sorts of possibilities for what we might shift to, not relying on the gas tax. As Representative Fitzgibbon said, this is an option that has been discussed for a long time. To make it real, there are probably some steps that we'll take this session to make sure that it continues to be one that we can consider fully.
I'll just add that I think I'm also very mindful of who will be paying these taxes. I worry about the landscapers, the gardeners, the baristas who have to drive into my district, while many of our more affluent people have the luxury of working from home. So I think that's where the details are going to be important, because we don't want to continue adding more regressive taxation to our already very regressive tax structure.
Can you clarify what you just said? System-wide tolling, is that something Democrats are looking at? And if so, can you describe?
No, I'm not aware of any proposal, but I'm just saying that as a resident of Capitol Hill, I personally think it would be great if there were tolls on not only 520, but I-90, 405, and I-5. But that's not an idea that has found a lot of traction in the legislature.
As the deputy majority leader who lives in Redmond and pays the tolls for 520, it's nice to have options that are not tolled.
You're going to go viral again. So.
It's possible. I also represent the 43rd district, so that is who I am.
Totally different subject. There's a bill to, this is regarding the Climate Commitment Act. There's a bill to address one of the complaints from the farming community. This would allow agriculture to use regular gasoline as well as red dye gasoline. And does that have a chance of making its way through both of your chambers?
I will just say that the two agricultural fuel exemptions in the Climate Commitment Act are topics that we are hoping to make headway on this year. And I know Representative Dent has a bill that's been introduced. I know there are other ideas percolating, but I hope that we're able to move that issue towards resolution this year.